The smell hit first. Not the food, though the kitchenette locale sent ribbons of garlic and slow, reduced tomato curling through every room, but the flowers. White lilies, replaced every Thursday afternoon by a woman who arrived in a town car and spoke to no one. They sat in a crystal vase on the marble hostess stand, and their perfume was thick enough to taste, sweet and funereal, and somehow wrong for a restaurant where a glass of wine cost more than most people's electric bill. Beyond the lilies, the dining room opened like the interior of a jewel box. Dark walnut paneling, brass fixtures turned low to an amber glow, leather banquettes the color of old blood. The sound was a specific frequency, the clink of heavy flatware against porcelain, the murmur of voices kept deliberately low, the occasional controlled laugh that never lasted too long. And in the far corner, against the back wall where two windows met at a right angle overlooking the alley and the street simultaneously, Table 7 sat empty. It was always empty on Friday nights. The white tablecloth was pressed to a geometric perfection that suggested it had never been touched by human hands. Two place settings of Christofle silver flanked a single candle in a smoked glass holder, unlit. No reservation card. No name. The table simply existed in a state of permanent readiness, like a loaded weapon in a velvet case. The waitstaff moved around it the way water moves around a stone in a river, naturally without thought, as though the avoidance were encoded in their bodies rather than learned. Marco Bianchi, the floor manager, had been at Locale for 11 years. He was a compact man with an immaculate side part and hands that were never still, always adjusting a napkin fold, realigning a fork, brushing an invisible crumb from a lapel. He ran the dining room the way an air traffic controller runs a radar screen, tracking every plate, every empty glass, every shift in a guest's posture that might signal the need for a check or a second bottle. He was good at his job. He was better at knowing what not to do, and the first thing he did not do, every Friday, was seat anyone at Table 7. The new girl did not know this. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she had been at Locale for 6 days. She had been hired on a Tuesday, a slow lunch shift, after a 7-minute interview in which Marco had asked her 3 questions, and she had answered each with the kind of brevity that made him suspect she was either very stupid or very smart. She was neither. She was tired. She was 34 years old, 5'7", with dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, and she moved through the dining room with a quality that Marco noticed but could not name. It was not grace, exactly, though she was graceful. It was economy. Every motion she made, lifting a tray, turning a corner, setting down a water glass, was executed with zero wasted movement, as though she had been trained to operate in spaces where inefficiency could get you killed. Her hands were the hands of someone who had done more than carry plates. The knuckles were slightly thickened. A faint scar ran along the web of skin between her left thumb and index finger. The kind of scar that comes from a blade slipping during repetitive, precise work. Knife work, not culinary. When she walked, her weight stayed centered over her hips. She never turned her back fully to a doorway. These were not things Marco consciously catalogued. They were things he felt, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm arrives. She made him slightly nervous, and he did not know why. On her first day, Angela, the senior waitress, a woman with lacquered nails and the diplomatic instincts of a Cold War ambassador, had given Elena the tour. The kitchen, the wine cellar, the private dining room on the second floor where birthday parties and business deals happened behind a soundproofed door, the alley entrance where deliveries came in and where, on certain nights, certain guests departed through a route that did not pass through the main dining room. Angela had shown her everything except the one thing that mattered most. She had gestured toward the back corner and said simply, "That table is not available on Fridays," and Elena had nodded, and that had been the end of the conversation. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But Angela had been at Locale long enough to mistake the absence of questions for the presence of understanding. She had confused Elena's silence for compliance. It was not compliance. It was the silence of a woman who had learned to absorb information without reacting to it, to file it and move on, because in the places she had been before this restaurant, Asking too many questions was a luxury that people who stayed alive did not indulge in. Friday arrived the way a held breath finally releases, not with a sound, but with a shift in pressure. The restaurant began to change around 4 in the afternoon. The kitchen moved from its usual rhythm to something tighter, more precise. Chef Moreau, a man who communicated primarily through the volume and velocity of his plating, began sending runners to check the walk-in for specific ingredients that were used only on this night. A particular cut of Wagyu, a wheel of aged pecorino that cost more per ounce than silver, saffron threads that arrived in a locked wooden box from a supplier who delivered to exactly 3 restaurants in the city. The front of house shifted too. Marco's hands moved faster. Angela checked her lipstick twice. The busboys polished glasses that were already clean, holding each one up to the light and turning it slowly, looking for phantoms of fingerprints that did not exist. The lilies seemed to lean forward in their vase. Even the light changed. The brass fixtures were dimmed another quarter turn, pulling the room deeper into amber, deepening shadows, making the space feel less like a restaurant and more like a chapel. Elena noticed all of it. She noticed the way the other staff kept glancing toward the front windows. She noticed that the valet station outside had been doubled, 2 attendants instead of 1, both wearing earpieces. She noticed that the back alley door had been unlocked from the inside, propped open an inch with a rubber wedge, as though someone might need to leave in a direction that did not involve the front entrance. She catalogued these details the way she had once catalogued the positions of rooftop observers in Fallujah, the way she had once noted which windows in a Kandahar marketplace were shuttered on a day when all the others were open. Not with fear, with attention. Pure, clinical, dispassionate attention. It was the only gift the army had given her that she had not tried to return. The rest, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to sit with her back to a door, the way her hands still shook on the anniversary of the ambush that killed Sergeant Rivera and Corporal Dunn on a road outside Bagram that was supposed to have been cleared. Those gifts she had tried to return every day for 2 years through therapy she could not afford, and medication she stopped taking, and the slow, exhausting work of building a civilian life from the wreckage of a military one. Her father had been career Army, a master sergeant who had served 24 years and retired to a pension that barely covered his medical bills. He had taught her 2 things. The first was that service is not a job, but a covenant. The second was that the covenant does not end when the uniform comes off. She carried both lessons like ammunition in a magazine she could not unload. By 7 o'clock, the dining room was full. Every table occupied except 1. Table 7 sat in its corner like a held note in a symphony, its emptiness somehow louder than all the conversation around it. Elena stood at the service station near the kitchen pass, rolling silverware into linen napkins with the mechanical precision of someone assembling rifle magazines. She watched the room. She watched the door. At 7:14, the door opened and an old man walked in. He did not walk in so much as arrive. Slowly, carefully, with the kind of deliberateness that suggested every step was a negotiation between will and pain. He was perhaps 78, perhaps 80, with a face that had been carved by decades into something beyond handsome or ugly, something purely structural, like a cliff face or the hull of a ship that had survived storms that sank newer vessels. His hair was white and cropped close in a style that had not changed since a barber on a military base had first cut it that way half a century ago. His shoulders were broad but carried at a forward angle, as though bearing an invisible weight. He wore a dark jacket, clean but not new, over a collared shirt buttoned to the throat. In his right hand a wooden cane, not a medical device but a companion. Something he gripped with the familiarity of a man who has carried a tool in his hand for so many years, it has become an extension of his skeleton. His left hand held the arm of a woman. She was smaller than him, white-haired, with the kind of face that holds beauty not in its features, but in its expression. A softness around the eyes, a mouth that defaulted to a slight smile, even when the rest of her was clearly exhausted. She wore a blue dress with a white collar, pressed and clean, and shoes that had been polished recently by someone whose hands shook slightly during the task. They stood in the doorway together, blinking against the warm light. and they looked like what they were. Two people who had dressed in their best clothes and driven across the city for a meal they probably could not afford, because tonight was a night that mattered, and they had chosen to mark it by sitting across from each other in a place where the napkins were made of cloth. Elena was at the hostess stand before Marco could move. She saw the old man's hand tighten on the cane as he took in the room, the low light, the murmured conversations, the prices he was already calculating behind eyes that were sharp and gray and still, after everything, undefeated. She saw the woman beside him squeeze his arm, a gesture that said, "I know, and I am here, and it does not matter," all in a single pressure of fingers against wool. Elena smiled. It was not a professional smile. It was the other kind. "Welcome," she said. "Table for two?" The old man nodded. His voice, when it came, was quiet and rough, like gravel under boot soles. "We have a reservation. Name's Callahan. Walter Callahan." Elena checked the book. The reservation was there, 7:15, party of two, noted in Marco's small, precise handwriting. But there was no table assignment next to it. That was unusual. Every other reservation had a number beside it. The Callahan's entry was bare. She looked up. The dining room was full. Every table occupied, every chair taken, except for the one in the far corner, the one with the pressed white cloth and the unlit candle and the silver that gleamed like a promise. "Right this way," Elena said. She led them through the dining room. Walter Callahan walked with his cane tapping a quiet rhythm on the hardwood, a sound that was patient and steady and somehow military in its regularity. His wife held his arm and looked around the room with the expression of someone visiting a country she had read about but never expected to see. They passed tables where men in suits glanced up and glanced away. They passed the service station where Angela stood with a tray of champagne flutes and a face that was beginning to change. Elena pulled out the chair for Mrs. Callahan first. The old woman sat down with a sigh of such profound relief that it was clear she had been on her feet for much of the day, and perhaps much of the week, and perhaps much of the year. Walter lowered himself into the opposite chair with the controlled descent of a man who refused to let gravity dictate terms. He hooked his cane over the table's edge and placed both hands flat on the white cloth, and for a moment he simply sat there, feeling the fabric under his palms, looking at the candle, looking at his wife. Elena lit the candle. The flame caught and held, steady and warm, and it threw soft light across both their faces. And something in Walter Callahan's expression shifted. Not a smile, not exactly, but a loosening of something that had been held tight for a very long time. It was their 47th wedding anniversary. Elena did not know this yet. She would learn it later, the way she would learn many things about this night, in fragments, in revelations, in the slow unraveling of assumptions that had seemed solid until the moment they dissolved. What she knew in this moment was that an old couple was sitting at an empty table in a restaurant where they had a reservation. What she did not know was that she had just placed them at the single most dangerous seat in the city. Marco materialized at her elbow like a man who had been summoned by a frequency only he could hear. His face was a controlled catastrophe, the muscles around his mouth and eyes engaged in a war between professional composure and something very close to panic. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. He leaned in, and his breath smelled of the espresso he drank continuously from a cup he kept behind the bar, and he said one sentence, "You need to move them. Now." Elena looked at him. She had been looked at by drill sergeants, by platoon leaders, by a full-bird colonel who once told her that her decision to disobey a direct order in Helmand Province was either the bravest or the stupidest thing he had seen in 30 years of service. She had been looked at by men who could end careers with a phone call, and men who could end lives with a nod. Marco's look was not in the same category. She recognized it, though. It was fear. Not anger. Fear. "There are no other tables," she said. Marco's hands, for the first time in 11 years, stopped moving. They hung at his sides like broken tools. Then they wait in the bar. They wait in the private room. They wait on the sidewalk. I don't care where they wait. But they cannot sit there. Elena looked at the Callahans. Walter had opened the menu and was holding it at arm's length, squinting slightly, his lips moving as he read the prices in a silent calculation that was clearly costing him something beyond money. Ruth Callahan was looking at the candle flame the way people look at sunsets, not seeing the physics of it, but feeling the metaphor. They were comfortable. They were settled. They were, for perhaps the first time in a long time, somewhere that made them feel like the world had not entirely forgotten they existed. "Why?" Elena said. Marco opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Because that table is reserved." "It was not reserved," Elena said. "I checked the book. There was no assignment for the Callahans' reservation, and Table 7 had no name on it." Marco looked at her with an expression she recognized from a different context, the expression of a superior officer confronting a subordinate who has followed the rules so precisely that they have accidentally detonated the entire chain of command. "That table," he said, "is always reserved. Every Friday. It is never written down. It does not need to be written down. Everyone knows." Elena did not blink. I did not know. The kitchen door swung open, and a runner emerged with 2 plates of antipasti for a table near the window. The sound of the door, a heavy, pneumatic whisper, seemed to punctuate the silence between Elena and Marco. In the corner, Walter Callahan set down his menu and looked at his wife, and whatever he saw in her face made him reach across the table and take her hand, and they sat like that. 2 old people holding hands over a white tablecloth, and the candle flame between them did not flicker. Marco leaned closer. His voice dropped to something below a whisper, a frequency designed to be felt in the chest, rather than heard by the ears. "He arrives at 8, sometimes 8:15. His men arrive first. 4 vehicles. If that table is not empty when they walk through that door, what happens next will not be a conversation. It will not be a negotiation. It will be a problem. And problems in this restaurant do not get solved. They get removed." Elena heard every word. She processed every implication. And somewhere deep in the architecture of her nervous system, in the place where fear is supposed to live, she felt nothing. Not bravery. Not defiance. Just the flat, calm, attentive emptiness she had learned to inhabit in places where the distance between a good decision and a catastrophic one was measured in seconds, not minutes. "Who is he?" she said. Marco did not answer the question. He answered a different one, the one she had not asked. "His name is Viktor Karev, and if you do not move that couple in the next 10 minutes, I cannot protect you from what happens after." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Angela, who had been pretending to polish a glass 6 feet away, set it down and walked into the kitchen without looking back. 2 busboys who had been clearing a nearby table accelerated their movements and disappeared toward the service corridor. Even the ambient sound of the dining room seemed to thin, as though the air itself had decided to make room. Elena knew the name. Not from this world. Not from the world of restaurants and reserved tables and town cars, but from the other world, the one she had left behind. She had heard it spoken in briefing rooms with fluorescent lighting and no windows. She had seen it printed in intelligence reports stamped with classification levels that meant the paper itself was counted and tracked. Viktor Karev, import-export, philanthropist, board member of 3 cultural foundations, generous donor to the city's children's hospital. And beneath all of that, beneath the charity galas and the museum dedications and the photographs in the society pages, a man whose name was spoken in a particular tone by people who understood that some names are not names at all, but warnings. She looked at Marco. She looked at the Callahans. Walter had shifted his attention from the menu to the room. His eyes, those gray, steady, unremarkable eyes, were moving across the space with a quality that Elena recognized because she saw it in the mirror every morning. He was reading the room, not casually, not the way a diner glances around to see who else is eating. He was reading it the way a man reads terrain, entry points, exit lines, site angles, the positions of the staff, the weight of the silence that had settled around his table like fog. He knows, Elena thought. He does not know the specifics. He does not know the name Karev or the protocol of Table 7. But he knows that the ground has shifted beneath him, and he is adjusting his balance without anyone seeing him do it. His hand on Ruth's had not changed its pressure. His posture had not altered. But his cane, which had been hooked casually over the table's edge, was now angled differently, positioned so that his right hand could reach it without looking down. Elena turned back to Marco. "I will handle it," she said. Marco searched her face for something, reassurance perhaps, or a plan, and found neither. What he found was a wall, smooth, featureless, unyielding. He nodded once, a tight, abbreviated motion, and retreated to his station behind the bar, where he began polishing a glass with the focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb. 7:43. Elena worked her section. She delivered a bottle of Barolo to Table 12. She cleared appetizer plates from Table 9. She refilled water glasses with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who understood that panic is contagious and calm is a weapon. At 7:51, she brought the Callahans their bread, a basket of warm ciabatta with olive oil and balsamic, and she watched Walter break a piece with his hands. Large hands, scarred hands. The right index finger was slightly crooked at the second knuckle, the way fingers get when they have been broken and set without proper medical attention. The thumbnail on his left hand was ridged and discolored, the kind of damage that comes from a crush injury, a hatch, a loading mechanism, something heavy and metal and unforgiving. "Beautiful place," Ruth said. She was looking around the room with genuine delight, her fear of the prices temporarily overridden by the pleasure of being somewhere warm and beautiful on a night that meant something. Walter nodded. He dipped the bread in oil. He chewed. He did not look at the door, but Elena could tell he was listening to it. At 7:58, the first vehicle arrived. Elena heard it before she saw it, the heavy, muffled growl of a large engine slowing to a stop, the kind of sound that expensive vehicles make when their drivers are trained to approach destinations at exactly the right speed to convey both precision and power. Through the front window, past the lilies, she saw it. A black Escalade with tinted windows, pulling to the curb with the deliberateness of a chess piece being placed on the board. Behind it, headlights. A second vehicle, then a third, then a fourth. 4 black SUVs, arranged in a line along the curb like a military convoy sanitized for civilian streets. The valet attendants moved toward the first vehicle, then stopped. They did not open the door. They waited. The engines idled. The dining room continued its murmur, but the frequency had changed. Conversations grew quieter, movements slowed, forks paused between plate and mouth. The staff at Locale had been through this arrival sequence enough times to recognize its choreography, and their bodies responded before their minds could form the word. Marco stood very still behind the bar. Angela had not re-emerged from the kitchen. The doors of the second and third SUVs opened first. Men stepped out. 4 from each vehicle, 8 men total, in dark suits that were cut to accommodate the shoulder holsters they wore with the casual disregard of people, for whom weapons are as mundane as wristwatches. They were not large men, most of them. They were efficient men. They moved with a coordinated economy that spoke of training and repetition, taking positions along the sidewalk, scanning the street, the windows, the roofline. One of them, stocky, with a jaw like a cinder block and hands that hung at his sides with the stillness of a man who has learned to keep them ready, approached the restaurant door. He did not open it. He looked through the glass, scanning the interior, and his gaze moved across the room in a systematic sweep until it reached the back corner, until it reached Table 7. His face did not change. It calcified. The muscles around his mouth locked into a configuration that was beyond anger. It was the expression of a system encountering an error so fundamental that it could not compute the appropriate response. He looked at Table 7. He looked at the old couple sitting at Table 7. He looked at the lit candle and the bread basket and the wine glasses that had just been filled with a Sangiovese that cost $62 a glass. He opened the door. The sound that entered with him was not a sound at all. It was the absence of sound. The street noise cut off as the heavy glass door swung shut behind him, and the dining room's ambient murmur dropped another register, and in the sudden, pressurized quiet, the tap of his shoes on the hardwood floor was as precise and final as a metronome counting down to 0. He crossed the room in 8 strides. He did not look at anyone. He did not need to. Every person in the restaurant understood on a cellular level that they were no longer the point of this evening. He stopped 3 feet from table 7. Walter Callahan looked up from his bread. Ruth Callahan's hand found her husband's on the tablecloth. The man in the dark suit opened his mouth. Elena stepped between them. She did not rush. She did not stride or storm or march. She simply appeared in the space between the man and the table the way a wall appears when you round a corner, suddenly, completely, without apology. She was holding a leather-bound wine list in her left hand, and she positioned herself so that her body was directly between the man's sightline and the Callahans. And she stood there with the composed stillness that had been built into her nervous system over 6 deployments and 14 years of service. The same stillness she had found in the doorway of a mud-brick compound in Helmand Province, with nothing between her and a hallway full of hostile contacts, except her training and the absolute unshakable belief that she would not move. That was the thing civilians never understood about combat veterans working service jobs. The apron and the order pad did not erase the wiring. The muscles still remembered. The eyes still tracked. The part of the brain that calculated threat angles and exit routes and the precise distance at which a situation transitions from tense to lethal, that part never clocked out. It sat behind every smile, every poured glass, every yes, sir, and right away, running its calculations in silence, waiting for the moment when the math changed. "This table is occupied," she said. "Can I seat you at the bar while you wait?" The man stared at her. He had not been interrupted during this procedure in the 4 years he had been managing Friday arrivals. He had not been spoken to by waitstaff at all, in fact, beyond the murmured greetings and the efficient service that were delivered with the eye contact of people addressing a natural disaster, respectfully, fearfully, and from a safe distance. He leaned forward. His voice was low, quiet, and carried the accent of a language that uses fewer vowels than English. "You are new," he said. "I am," Elena said. "Then you do not understand. This table is reserved. Every Friday. For Mr. Karev." Elena did not lean back. She did not adjust her stance. The wine list in her left hand did not tremble. "There was no reservation in the book," she said. "This couple has a confirmed reservation. They are seated. They are eating." The man looked past her at Walter Callahan, and what he saw was an old man with a cane and a breadbasket, and what he communicated with his look was that old men with canes and breadbaskets were not a category of obstacle he was equipped to take seriously. "They will need to move," he said. Elena said nothing for a moment. She let the silence do the work. Let it fill the space between them. Let it press against the walls of the restaurant. Let every person in the room feel the weight of what was about to happen. "They will not," she said. The temperature in the room dropped. Not literally. The thermostat had not changed, but the quality of the air shifted, thickened, became the kind of air that precedes either violence or weather. The man in the dark suit straightened. His right hand moved 2 inches toward his waist, not reaching for anything, not yet, but repositioning, a preparatory gesture, a statement of capability. The front door opened again. 2 more men entered. They were younger, taller, and they moved to positions on either side of the first, creating a formation that was not accidental. 3 men in dark suits, arranged in a shallow crescent, facing a waitress in a black apron who was holding a wine list like a clipboard. Marco, behind the bar, gripped the glass he was holding so tightly that his fingertips went white. A woman at table 4 reached for her husband's hand under the tablecloth. The room held its breath. And then the last SUV's door opened. Viktor Karev stepped out of the vehicle the way a king steps from a throne room into a courtyard, without hurry, without performance, simply occupying the next space that existed for him to occupy. He was 57 years old, 6'1", and he weighed exactly what he had weighed when he was 30. A discipline maintained not through vanity, but through the same principle that kept his suits pressed and his shoes polished and his empire organized. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, a white shirt open at the collar. His hair was silver at the temples and black everywhere else, swept back with the kind of precision that required either an excellent barber or an iron will. His face was the face of a man who had been handsome in his youth and had aged into something more useful, authority. The bones were strong, the jaw defined, the mouth a straight line that suggested smiles were rationed and given only to those who had earned them. His eyes were dark, nearly black in the low street light, and they moved across the scene in front of him, the restaurant facade, the men at the door, the faces in the window, with the unhurried assessment of a man who has never encountered a situation he could not control. He walked toward the entrance. His men parted for him the way the sea parts for ships. He did not acknowledge them. He entered the restaurant and paused in the doorway, and the light from the brass fixtures caught his face, and in that moment every person in the room understood something fundamental. The evening did not begin when they sat down, when they ordered, when they tasted the first sip of wine. The evening began now. He saw it immediately. The occupied table, the old couple, the three men standing in a formation that he recognized as a problem in its early stages, and between his men and the table, a woman in a black apron, who was standing with her weight centered, and her shoulders square, and her eyes fixed on a point that was not the floor. Karev walked toward the scene. His footsteps were nearly silent. The soles of his shoes were leather, thin, and they made contact with the hardwood in a way that was more felt than heard. The diners he passed did not look up. They looked down. They studied their plates, their glasses, their hands, with the sudden intense focus of people who have decided that invisibility is the evening's most important course. He reached his men. He did not speak to them. He looked past them at Elena. Elena looked back. It was a particular kind of looking, not aggressive, not challenging, but absolute. She did not flinch. She did not smile. She did not perform the kind of facial expression that people use to signal that they know they are in over their depth and are hoping for mercy. She simply stood there and returned his gaze with the steady, measured attention of a person who has looked at things far more dangerous than this and has not blinked. Viktor Karev had been looked at by presidents and prosecutors, and men who commanded armies of their own. He had been looked at by people who wanted to kill him, and people who wanted to be him, and people who were simply afraid of what he represented. He had catalogued and categorized every type of human gaze, and this one, this waitress's calm, unbroken, unperformative eye contact, did not fit any category he recognized. He tilted his head, a fraction of an inch. The way a predator tilts its head when it encounters another predator's tracks in territory, it considered its own. His lead man leaned in and spoke quickly, quietly, in a language that was not English. The explanation was brief. New waitress, seated guests at the table, refuses to move them. The tone carried an implicit request for instruction, and an implicit promise of swift resolution. Karev raised one hand, not a wave, not a gesture, a suspension. Motion stopped. Sound stopped. His men went still the way machines go still when the power is cut. Instantly, completely, waiting for reactivation. He looked at Elena. "Who is sitting at my table?" he said. It was not a question. It was a sentence shaped like a question, delivered in a voice that was quiet and even, and carried the particular weight of a man who was accustomed to speaking once. Elena turned slightly, not fully, not giving him her back, and gestured toward the Callahans. Walter was sitting upright, his hands on the table, his cane within reach. Ruth was holding her wineglass, but not drinking. They were both looking at the scene unfolding in front of them, and on Walter's face there was an expression that Elena would later describe to herself as recognition, not of the man, not of the name, not, but of the situation. He had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the air changed and the mathematics of survival shifted, and the only variable that mattered was what you did in the next 30 seconds. "A couple," Elena said. "They have a reservation. It is their 47th anniversary." She paused. She had not known this when she seated them. Ruth had told her while Elena was pouring the water, had said it softly, almost shyly, as though announcing a wedding anniversary in a restaurant. This expensive was a kind of confession. Karev's eyes moved from Elena to the Callahans. He studied them the way he studied everything, without sentimentality, without haste, with the forensic attention of a man who makes decisions about people the way surgeons make decisions about tissue. What he saw, an old man with military posture and scarred hands and a cane that was positioned for function, not display. A woman with dignity in her bearing and love in her face, and a dress that had been chosen with the kind of care that meant tonight mattered in a way that transcended a meal. He saw two people who were not afraid of him, because they had either not yet understood who he was, or had understood and decided it did not matter. He looked back at Elena. "You will have to wait like everyone else," Elena said. The sentence landed in the room like a detonation in a library. Absolute, shocking, and followed by a silence so complete that the sound of the candle flame at table 7, a faint, living hiss of paraffin and air, became audible. Karev's lead man moved, a step forward, weight shifting, right hand clearing the jacket. It was a reflex, not a decision. The response of a body trained to interpret certain stimuli as threats, and to neutralize them before the conscious mind could intervene. Karev said one word. The language was not English. The word was short, sharp, and absolute. His man stopped, mid-stride. His hand returned to his side. He did not step back, but he ceased to advance, and in the space between those two states, not retreating, not attacking, he waited. The dining room was silent, not the comfortable silence of satiated guests, or the polite silence of a pause between courses. This was the silence of a room full of people who understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, and were unsure whether to be fascinated or terrified. A man at table 11 set down his fork with exaggerated care, as though the sound of silverware against porcelain might trigger something irreversible. Karev looked at Elena for a long time. In the amber light, his dark eyes were unreadable, not cold, not warm, not angry, not amused. They were calculating, running an equation whose variables included the woman in front of him and the couple behind her, and the room full of witnesses, and the 11 years of unbroken protocol, and the single, irreducible fact that she had not moved. "Why?" he said. Elena did not pretend to misunderstand. "Because they are here," she said. "Because they came in and sat down and ordered, and they are eating. And because moving them now would mean telling two people that their evening, their anniversary, matters less than someone else's habit." Karev's mouth did not move. His body did not shift. But something changed behind his eyes. A recalculation, a reassessment. The kind of micro-adjustment that happens when a man who has controlled every room he has ever entered encounters a force that does not respond to the physics of control. "You know who I am," he said. Elena held his gaze. "I know that you are a man who wants to sit at a table that is currently occupied," she said. "Beyond that, it does not change the situation." The air in the restaurant was so still that the condensation on a water glass at table 3 began to slide, and the sound of the single droplet hitting the tablecloth was as audible as a heartbeat. Walter Callahan stood up. He did it slowly, cane first planted firmly, then both hands on the table edge, then the controlled, deliberate ascent of a man who had once risen from foxholes and helicopter decks, and briefing room chairs, and who now rose from restaurant tables with the same, unhurried authority. He was not tall, 5'10", maybe 5'11" in his youth, compressed now by years and gravity. But when he stood, something in the room shifted. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. The slight stoop that gravity and age had carved into his spine straightened by a degree that should not have been possible. And for an instant, just an instant, the man standing at table 7 was not an old man with a cane. He was something else entirely. "Son," he said, and his voice was quiet and rough, and carried the particular timbre of a man who had once given commands in places where the consequences of hesitation were measured in lives, not inconveniences. "Sit down." The 2 words were not aggressive. They were not threatening. They were delivered with the same calm, absolute economy with which a master craftsman sets a level on a surface, no force necessary, just precision. The room felt the weight of them. "We are happy to move," Walter said. He looked at his wife. Ruth was looking up at him with an expression that combined tenderness and something older, something that recognized the voice he was using because she had heard it before, decades ago, in a different life, when it had carried across distances measured in yards and terror rather than restaurant tables and awkwardness. "We do not want trouble," Walter continued. "We will take our bread and sit in the bar and finish our evening there, and it will still be a fine evening, because my wife is here, and that is the only thing that has ever made any evening fine." Elena turned to him. "No," she said. "You will not move." She said it without raising her voice. She said it with the same flat, calm certainty with which she had addressed Karev, and in the space between her words and the silence that followed them, something crystallized in the room. A understanding that this was not about a table. It was about a line that existed not on the floor of the restaurant, but in the moral architecture of a woman who had decided in this moment, on this Friday, in this amber-lit room that smelled of lilies and garlic and money, that some things do not bend. Victor Karev looked at Walter Callahan. He looked at him not with anger or impatience, but with the forensic attention of a man who has survived long enough to know that underestimation is the most expensive mistake a person can make. He saw the posture. He saw the hands. He saw the cane and the way it was held, not leaned on, but gripped, the way a man grips a rifle or a rappelling line or the hand of a comrade being pulled from wreckage. He saw the scar tissue on the knuckles and the crooked finger and the eyes, those flat, gray, unremarkable eyes that held a quality Karev recognized because he had seen it in very few men, and never, not once, in a man holding a breadbasket in an Italian restaurant. He had seen it in men who had killed and been willing to die, and had done both without flinching. "What is your name?" Karev said. He was not addressing Elena. "Walter Callahan," the old man said. The name moved through the room without creating any visible disturbance, but in the space behind Karev's eyes, something detonated. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first and only time in the memory of any person who had ever worked at Locale, Victor Karev's composure faltered. It was not a collapse. It was a fracture, a hairline crack in a surface that had been assumed to be seamless, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the surface reformed and the wall was whole again. But those 2 seconds were enough. His lead man saw it. Elena saw it. The entire room felt it without knowing what it was. A shift in gravity, as though the building had tilted a degree off level and then corrected. Karev took 1 step forward, not toward the table, toward Walter. And for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, his body language changed. The authority was still there. It could not be removed any more than you could remove the weight from a stone, but it had been joined by something else. Something that looked, in the amber light, remarkably like reverence. "Sergeant Callahan," he said. Walter's expression did not change. He neither confirmed nor denied. He stood with his cane and his scarred hands and his white hair, and he waited. The way he had waited in 100 situations, where the next sentence determined whether the outcome was conversation or catastrophe. Karev spoke. He spoke quietly, in English, and the words were for Walter alone, but in the pressurized silence of the restaurant they carried to every corner of the room, to every table, to every ear that was straining to hear what was happening in the back corner where the candle still burned. "My father," Karev said. Pyotr Karev, 1968. Khe-san. A tremor passed through Walter Callahan's body. Not weakness, not infirmity, but the involuntary response of a nervous system confronting a word it had spent 5 decades trying to bury. Khe-san, 77 days. The siege that lasted from January to April of 1968, when 6,000 Marines held a combat base against 40,000 North Vietnamese regulars, in conditions that reduced human experience to its most primitive components: mud, blood, noise, and the absolute, unrelenting proximity of death. Walter had been there. He had been 23 years old, a staff sergeant with the 26th Marines, and he had done things during those 77 days that were later described in official reports with language so clinical it sounded like autopsy notes. He had received the Navy Cross for his actions, a decoration that sits 1 level below the Medal of Honor, and is awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. A piece of metal and ribbon that now lived in a shoebox in the top shelf of a closet in a small apartment on the east side of the city, next to a folded flag and a photograph of 19 men standing in red mud, 11 of whom did not come home. He had carried men. He had treated wounds with supplies meant for a force 1/3 their size. He had held a position on Hill 861 for 9 hours after his commanding officer was killed, directing fire and coordinating medevac with a radio whose antenna had been shot off, replaced with a metal coat hanger straightened and taped to the housing with surgical tape from his own medical kit. And he had, on the 41st day of the siege, pulled a young Vietnamese interpreter from a collapsed bunker. The interpreter had been working for the Americans, a translator whose skills and courage had made him a target of the North Vietnamese forces. He had been buried for 6 hours under sandbags and timber when the bunker took a direct hit. Walter had dug with his hands. He had dislocated 2 fingers and fractured his right wrist, and he had kept digging because the interpreter was conscious and speaking, reciting something in Vietnamese that Walter could not understand, but that he later learned was a prayer his mother had taught him, a prayer for safe passage. Walter had pulled him out. He had splinted the man's leg with a rifle stock and carried him 400 meters to the aid station through mortar fire that turned the ground into a churning algebra of dirt and metal and probability. The interpreter's name was Pyotr Karev. He was not Vietnamese. He was the son of a Russian father and a Vietnamese mother, a man caught between empires who had chosen to serve as a bridge rather than a boundary. He survived. He was evacuated. He eventually made his way to the United States, where he built a life in a city that did not know his name, but where, decades later, his son would build an empire. Viktor Karev's father had told him the story exactly once. He had told it on his deathbed, in a hospital room in Brooklyn, with tubes in his arms and monitors beeping the countdown of his remaining heartbeats. He had described the hands that had dug him out, the American sergeant with the broken wrist who had carried him through fire. He had never known the man's full name. In the chaos of Khe-san, names were luxuries that got lost in the noise. But he had remembered the voice. Rough, quiet, steady. The voice of a man giving commands to dirt and timber and mortar fire, telling them to get out of his way, and meaning it. Walter, Karev said. The first name came out differently from the last, softer, heavier, loaded with a weight that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with debt. My father died in 2004. His last words were about the man who pulled him from the ground. Walter Callahan's hand tightened on his cane. His jaw worked once, twice, the muscles moving beneath weathered skin, processing something that was larger than this room, larger than this night, larger than the collision of coincidence and reservation systems that had brought him to this table. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The language for what he was feeling had not been invented, and if it had, it would not have fit in his mouth. Ruth Callahan reached up and took her husband's hand. She did not know the full story. Walter had never told her the details of Khe-san, had parceled out his war in fragments over decades, a sentence here, a name there, a nightmare explained away as a bad night's sleep. But she knew his hand. She knew when it trembled. She knew what the trembling meant. Karev turned to his lead man. He said 3 words in a language that was not English, The man's face went blank, not shocked, not confused, but reformatted, the way a screen goes blank when it receives an input that overrides all previous programming. He turned on his heel. He walked to the door. He stepped outside. The other men followed. 8 men in dark suits filed out of the restaurant in a line that was as orderly and silent as their entry had been, and the door closed behind them, and the room exhaled. Karev looked at Elena. "What is your name?" he said. "Elena Vasquez," she said. He studied her the way he had studied Walter, with that forensic, unhurried attention that seemed to x-ray the surface and read the structure beneath. "You served," he said. It was not a question. Elena nodded once. "Where?" "Afghanistan." "Iraq." She paused. "Other places." Karev nodded. The nod was slow, heavy, and it contained an understanding that did not require elaboration. The understanding of a man who had grown up in a household shaped by war's aftermath, who had watched his father flinch at fireworks and go silent on certain dates and grip the edges of tables during thunderstorms with hands that remembered being buried alive. He reached into his jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate, a man who understood that sudden movements in his line of work carry specific consequences. He withdrew a card. It was not a business card. It was matte black, with a single phone number embossed in silver. No name, no title. He set it on the hostess stand. "Call this number Monday," he said. "Ask for Dmitri. Tell him Viktor Karev wants to speak with Elena Vasquez about a position." He turned back to the Callahans. He walked to table 7. He did not loom. He did not tower. He stood at the side of their table with the same controlled stillness with which he had entered the restaurant. But something in its quality had changed. The stillness was no longer the stillness of authority. It was the stillness of a man standing at a graveside. He extended his hand to Walter. Not downward, the way one extends a hand to a seated person. He held it at mid-height, palm open, the way men of a certain generation and a certain experience extend hands to each other, as equals. Walter took it. The grip lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, 58 years of distance collapsed. Khe-san, the bunker, the coat hanger antenna, the prayer in Vietnamese, the 400 meters of mortar fire, the broken wrist, the splinted leg, the fact that a young interpreter lived and grew old and fathered a son who now stood in an Italian restaurant holding the hand of the man who had made all of it possible. Karev released the grip. He straightened. He looked at Ruth. "Happy anniversary," he said. He turned and walked toward the door. He did not look back. His footsteps on the hardwood were silent, and the room parted for him in the same way it always did, but the quality of the parting had changed. It was not fear that moved people aside. It was something else. He paused at the hostess stand. He spoke to Marco, who was standing behind the bar with the expression of a man who has just witnessed a solar eclipse and is not sure the sun will come back. "The Callahans' dinner is on my account," Karev said. "Everything they order. The wine, the dessert, the coffee, all of it. And Marco," he looked at the floor manager with eyes that were, for the first time all evening, not calculating. "They sit at table 7 every Friday. From now on." He left. The door closed. The 4 black SUVs pulled away from the curb in a line that was as precise and silent as their arrival, and the street was empty again, and the lilies on the hostess stand trembled once in the draft of the closing door, and then were still. The restaurant returned to life the way a frozen river returns to flow, slowly, unevenly, with the occasional crack and surge of released tension. Conversations resumed. Forks moved. A woman at table 6 laughed, and the sound was too loud and too bright, and she covered her mouth and looked around apologetically, and the man across from her touched her hand and smiled. The sommelier, who had been standing motionless in the wine alcove for the duration of the encounter with a bottle of Brunello held at a 45-degree angle, completed his pour with hands that trembled only once. A busboy who had been frozen mid-stride with a tub of dirty plates resumed his path toward the kitchen as though nothing had happened. But his rote took him wide around table 7, and his eyes did not leave the floor. Marco unclenched his fingers from the glass he had been holding and set it down with the care of a man placing a newborn in a crib. He looked at Elena across the room. He looked at her the way cartographers look at newly discovered continents, with the disorienting recognition that the map he had been using was incomplete. Elena stood at the hostess stand. She looked at the black card with the silver number. She did not pick it up. Not yet. She looked at table 7, where Walter and Ruth Callahan were sitting in the candlelight, and Walter had broken another piece of bread, and Ruth was looking at him with an expression that contained 47 years of mornings, and arguments, in hospital waiting rooms, and laughter, and silence, and the specific, irreducible knowledge that the man across from her had once crawled through fire to pull a stranger from the earth because that was who he was, and that was what he did, and nothing, not time, not pain, not the weight of memory, had ever changed that. Elena picked up the card. She put it in her apron pocket. She walked to table 7. "How is the bread?" she said. Walter looked up. His eyes were dry. His hands were steady. But his voice, when it came, carried a roughness that had nothing to do with age. "Best I have had in a long time," he said. Elena nodded. She refilled their water. She adjusted the candle. She moved to her next table, and the evening continued, and the restaurant hummed with its ordinary music of crystal and silver and low conversation. 3 months later, Elena Vasquez stood in the lobby of Karev Holdings International, on the 42nd floor of a building that overlooked the river and the city and the bridges that connected them. She was wearing a dark suit, not the kind that comes off a department store rack, but the kind that is measured and cut and fitted, the kind that accommodates a shoulder holster without disrupting the line of the fabric. Her hair was pulled back in the same tight configuration she had worn at Locale, but the rest of her had changed, not in substance, but in context, the way a diamond changes when it is moved from a drawer to a setting. The exhaustion that had lived behind her eyes for 2 years, the residue of 12-hour shifts and shared apartments, and the slow, grinding arithmetic of survival on a waitress's wage, had been replaced by something sharper. Focus. Purpose. The look of a woman who has been handed a mission that matches her capabilities for the first time since she took off the uniform. In her hand, she held a leather portfolio containing a security assessment of Victor Karev's personal protection detail, an assessment that had taken her 3 weeks to compile and that identified 17 vulnerabilities in the existing protocols, each one described with the clinical precision of a woman who had spent a decade identifying the exact places where systems break. She had been hired not as a waitress, not as a favor, not as charity. She had been hired because Victor Karev had looked at her and seen what he saw in very few people. A person who would stand in front of a force she could not defeat and refuse to move. Not because she did not understand the danger, but because she understood it completely and had decided that the principle was worth more than the fear. She had been hired because she was, in Karev's precise and unyielding calculus, the rarest thing his empire could acquire. A person whose loyalty was not for sale because it had never been on the market. It was given freely to those who earned it, and once given, it could not be taken back. On Friday evenings, table 7 at Locale was still reserved, but the reservation was now for 2, Walter and Ruth Callahan, who arrived every Friday at 7:15 and sat in the candlelight and ordered the ciabatta and the sangiovese. And Walter would break the bread with his scarred hands, and Ruth would look at the flame, and they would sit there together in the warm amber light of a corner that had once belonged to power and now belonged to something older and more durable. Marco still polished glasses behind the bar. Angela still checked her lipstick. The Lilies still arrived on Thursday afternoons, but the valet station no longer doubled its staff on Fridays, and the back alley door stayed locked, and the only person who reserved table 7 was an old man with a cane who arrived on time and tipped 30% and said thank you to every person who served him, because that was who he was, and that had always been who he was, and nothing that the world had done to him, not war, not poverty, Not the long, grinding indifference of a country that hands its veterans a flag and a handshake and then looks away, had ever been strong enough to change it. Some tables are not reserved by power. They are earned by the kind of strength that does not announce itself, does not demand recognition, does not arrive in convoys of black SUVs, with men in dark suits and weapons under their jackets. It is the strength of a man who digs through rubble with broken hands. It is the strength of a woman who stands between danger and decency and does not move. It is the strength that is forged not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the quiet, persistent, unglamorous decision to be decent when it is easier to be afraid.